Redeemer. And over the past week or so, we've been given a number of opportunities to focus on the things that divide us, haven't we? Issues of race and economics and sexuality and ethnicity. These things are often visible and obvious, and so they're easy for us to focus on. But the problem is that when we focus on the things that are right in front of us like that, and we stay at the surface of it, we fail to go any deeper into the questions that are being raised. We fail to recognize that for those who are impacted by these things that are issues or questions for us, that these are not theoretical issues for some of these folks, that these may well be matters of life and death. And we oversimplify these things at our own peril. For when we do, we insulate ourselves from any opportunity to grow in our understanding of others and their stories and their struggles. And we ignore the things that we share in common, choosing instead to simply focus on the few things that define us, we think, as different kinds of people. And in doing so, we fail to honor our shared humanity, and we fail to honor the Creator of us all. Now, where I'm going with this is a few things that have been in the news. This past week or so in Baltimore, the city has been completely on edge. It's been the site of both violent protests and peaceful marches, of thrown rocks and images of people standing together, trying to unite and bring things back around. The media tends to focus on the bad, and then so do we. And an oversimplified view of what's happening there assigns very clear roles just based on race. And traditional media and social media have done nothing to keep us from doing that most of the time. Facebook and Twitter carry provocative headlines and images, trying to frame the riots in the most simple terms, and the protests as nothing more than the acts of rowdy African American, usually men, who have no regard for the law or the police who enforce it. But the truth is rarely that simple, is it? And in this case, it's not that simple either. I think much of what has happened, much like what happened in Ferguson a few months ago, it seems that what happened is years and decades of anger and struggle finally reached a boiling point. And people who for their entire lives had no voice and weren't listened to finally ended up turning to the only form of expression they thought they could get attention with. Now, I don't pretend to understand how a community can think that burning and looting stores and throwing rocks at police officers is going to fix anything. But at the same time, I don't pretend to have any idea what it's like to grow up in an impoverished inner city area that's devoid of opportunity and hope. But what if we took the time to sit with somebody who did know what that was like? And to hear them out, to hear their story, to allow ourselves to share our own stories and identify with each other not as black or white or rich or poor, but simply as humans, as children of God. About an hour south of on I-95 from there, this past week the Supreme Court heard arguments on marriage. Specifically, do states have the right to prohibit who can get married? Is marriage something that is not available for same-sex couples is the question that they're wrestling with. Now, before you tune me out, hear me out. This is right now one of the most divisive issues in our culture. The lines are drawn so clearly and so rigidly. And there's really no need for it to be that way. Protesters and supporters on both sides of this have descended upon D.C., making all the noise that they can make on both sides. Crazy claims and predictions have been made by preachers who see this as the beginning of the end of America as we know it. I even found one yesterday, a preacher who claims that this decision could be dress rehearsal for the mark of the beast. Maybe just a little overstated. It's seen as an evil that has to be battled and banished. And the things that are said are just awful and hurtful and they're unnecessary because they're said toward an issue as opposed to any person that they may know. Unfortunately, folks on the other side quickly dismiss their opponents as well, and we miss the chance to maybe learn from each other, to grow in our humanity and in our faith and as a people. Now, regardless of where you come down on this, the truth is this: we share something much deeper than our disagreements. We share the image of God. And if we believe that men and women are created in the image of God, then we need to be very, very careful with our condemnations. Because we might not be condemning just the person. We could even go further and look at stories like Bruce Jenner's interview that he gave. And his journey and his struggle, and we could spout easy answers for all that we see as wrong with that whole story. And it'd be easy to question and condemn and to believe that this is simply a perversion and another opportunity to shun another. But that's his story, and that's his struggle. I don't understand it, to be perfectly honest. I don't know how comfortable I am accepting his story. But I do know this. We are not called upon to judge the worthiness of another. We are simply told that we are to love. In our reading from 1 John, you heard that over and over again, and there were no tests included in there for who gets it. And that means that we have to listen and learn before we scream and criticize. And in fact, if we're willing to listen and learn, we might not ever get to the screaming and the criticizing. Now, you can fill in some more examples of your own, from your own life and from your own experience, and I encourage you to do that, and to think on those things and those places where this might begin to apply. But here's the thing that concerns me the most these days, especially as I watch cities burn and Christians scream at each other. We're hardening the lines between us. And the harder those lines get, the less we allow ourselves to connect with all of our human family. And the less we connect with all of our human family, the less fully human we are. We live in a world that is simply divided into us and them. And we decide who is us and who is them based on whatever criteria we think matter. It might be race, it might be nationality or sexuality or theology or economics or any other number of things that we use to categorize. But what if we're wrong? What if all of our efforts at defining and assigning labels and categories is actually what it means to be sinful? What if the greatest sin is categorizing and labeling and dividing? When we view the world as being us and them, then we're saying that there are winners and losers. And we want to make sure that the right side, whatever that is, wins. Whatever that means. And we want to make sure we're on that side. Came across a story this week as I was working on this of a man who lives in this kind of tension. He lives in a place where us and them are very clearly defined. Father Greg Boyle is a Jesuit priest who spent more than the last 20 years ministering in a community in Los Angeles that is just riddled with gangs. So he spends his time ministering to these members of gangs and to the families and the community that are impacted by this. This is a guy with some credibility on divided communities. And this is a statement that he made in his latest book. And this is what just really grabbed me this week. He says, with Jesus, there is no us and them. There is just us. That's such a simple statement, but it's so true. And that's how the world will be healed. That's how we will be healed. When we realize that we're all in this together, that we're all members of the human family and of God's family, then we can change and treat each other as friends and family, not as opponents and enemies. When we do this, we experience conversion. And we can experience this kind of conversion over and over and over again. In fact, we must experience this kind of conversion over and over again if we want to grow into being who God declares us to be. Our text today deals with this. It's from the early days of the Christian church, when the movement was gaining momentum and new people were joining their ranks every day. And as this was happening, the workload for the apostles got to be too much. There were people who needed to be fed and food that needed to be delivered. So they chose 7 deacons to help out with that. One of those was Stephen, whose martyrdom we can read about in Acts chapter 7. Another was Philip, who we read about today. And after Stephen's death, the believers were forced to scatter from where they were all gathered in Jerusalem and flee to separate, safer places because of the persecution that Saul was unleashing on them. Philip ended up in Samaria, where he moved from waiting on tables to preaching and healing and working miracles. And so much was happening there that Peter and John were sent down there to check it out and make sure that it was being done right. Well, not long after that, an angel appears to Philip and tells him to leave where he is and go south on a very dangerous wilderness road. That's it. That's the sum total of his instructions. Get on this road and go south. And it would have seemed reasonable, I think, for Philip to have questioned why he was being sent from a location where his ministry was bearing a lot of fruit out into the wilderness with no task to do. But he got up and did what he was told. And when he got there, he found a traveler. And he was told to approach him, too. And he did. And this is where the story starts to get interesting. The traveler was an Ethiopian eunuch who was also a very well-placed official in the government of his country. For some reason, he had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and he was on his way home when Philip found him. And for some reason, this man had a scroll of Isaiah's prophecy. Now, those were not easy to get. So I don't know if that speaks to his connections or his wealth or whatever, but as he's riding along in his chariot, he has a scroll of the prophecy of Isaiah, and as was often done, then he was reading it out loud. Philip approaches him and asks if he knows if he understands what he's reading. And the man says, I need a guide. The Ethiopian could see the surface there, but he didn't have the context to understand who this was that was being discussed here. So Philip explains to him the story of Jesus, and after that the man wants to be baptized, and so they stopped and they did just that. And when they came up out of the water, and I have to say that when I read the way that those words flow there, it almost sounds as if it was a baptism for both of them that day. When they come up out of the water, Philip's immediately taken away, sent to another region to preach, and the Ethiopian went home rejoicing over what had happened to him. Now, that's a great story about leading another person to faith, right? I mean, that's the only way I ever heard this story presented growing up, was this was a story about evangelism. Philip goes and he finds a lost person and helps this lost person to not be lost anymore. And that's maybe some of it, but today, though, I want to suggest that a different kind of conversion happened that day, and it happened to Philip as well. You see, the Ethiopian eunuch was different in a lot of ways. He was a foreigner. He looked different. He spoke differently. He was rich. He was also sexually marginalized because of his physical condition. In fact, the Old Testament law spelled out very clearly that he could never be a full participant in the temple because of what had happened to him. Yet despite the fact that he had all of these things going against him, something made him want to be a part. Something drove him to go and to worship at this temple, even though it had been made very clear to him that he was never going to be accepted there. His condition made it where he didn't fit the rigid, neat categories that existed. And therefore he would be seen as a misfit and a challenge to the comfortable system that was in place. Does that sound like anything that we deal with today? Are our categories maybe being shaken up a little bit like that? Now, I imagine that approaching someone like this might not have been easy for Philip, because the man was as different from him as he could imagine in so many ways, yet his faithfulness to his calling pushed him forward. And he goes, and he's invited to climb into the chariot and to sit with this man, where they talk, and they learn, and they have the opportunity to see each other in a different light. And I have to wonder if it might have been Philip's willingness simply to sit by him, and to hear him out and to talk to him that mattered every bit as much as what he said. That's not to say that his explanation of Jesus' story didn't matter. But if he had done that shouting on a street corner, it wouldn't have been heard. But climbing up into the chariot and sitting down to this one who was so different and who was such a challenge to the system, that made the difference for him. And I suspect that something happened to Philip that day, for he had the opportunity to see that the divisions and the categories that the system said mattered were being turned upside down in this new movement of the Spirit. And as he left that place, I think he probably went with a much wider view of what God is doing, and a much more open view of God's kingdom than he had before. Legend has it that this Ethiopian official went back to his country and carried the gospel of Christ with him, and from him, Christianity began to take root in that country. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church still looks back today to this man as an important figure in their history. If that is true, it is because two men from very different worlds were willing to set aside their own biases and sit together and listen to each other and to God. Now that's a great conversion story. And this kind of conversion, it can and it should happen to us all the time. Every time we're willing to sit and listen, every time that we value another just because they're human, every time we recognize and speak to the image of the Creator in another, these are all opportunities for conversion in ourselves and in the other person and in our world. Who knows what might come of that? If we stopped accepting the easy answers and the cliches and the stereotyping and instead simply got to know each other, we find that there's far more that we share in common than we might ever imagine. We might find ways to celebrate shared humanity. We might find ways to be more fully human. And in so doing, we'll worship our God more fully, because we're honoring both the Creator and the one who was created in God's image. And we might just find that we can deal with the problems and the issues and the questions that dominate our culture in a constructive and a positive way. We'll stop talking about issues and start relating to people. And I know that sounds somewhat pie in the sky, and it's certainly not an easy thing to do. In fact, at least for a while, it may be one of the most difficult things that some of us have ever done. Because the prejudices and the biases that we carry around with us may have been there for a long, long time, and they won't be discarded overnight. And it will take us working together to see real change. But before any of us declare this task to be impossible, remember this: we are resurrection people. Even death is not the end of the story. If we believe that to be true, then it's time we got serious about life. With Jesus, there is no us and them. There's only us. Let us live like people who believe that to be true.